that I'm not the ranking expert on Jeremiah Lee because he will remain a mysterious figure to us all by the time I'm finished. But here he is in wigs that they just don't make anymore. The face of a man who was the master of his universe in the days just before the Revolutionary War. A man who was deeply plugged into the British Empire and a top dog in Massachusetts. We don't know a great deal about Lee. He wasn't particularly the subject of diary entries or memoirs or reminiscences. We do know that he was big as a house, and that we know that not only from this portrait by Copley, but also from the fact that John Adams' only diary about Jeremiah Lee is that he was notable as the fattest man in Massachusetts. But I think it's an interesting portrait. Obviously, Copley could paint anything, including a tiny head in the middle of all this brocade. It's interesting to think about Copley. His studio was full of costumes. People would come to sit to him, and he would dress them up in costumes. So we see portrait after portrait after portrait of the missuses of the burghers of Boston, all wearing the same beautiful dress. I think this might have been Jeremiah Lee's own coat, but I don't think we see it in other Copley paintings. But one of the things I like to think about this painting is that you can pick up some of the gravitas of this man in that little face there, somewhat above the center of this picture. There were a lot of other people, of course, who were involved in trade overseas and who were responsible for sending ships out and getting ships back and employing people in a very dangerous occupation. But I like this portrait a lot for what it seems to say about Lee. He's not smug, I think, here. He is a man who's very deeply engaged in a serious transatlantic operation and is doing a very good job at that. So one of the great ironies, I think, about Jeremiah Lee is if we say that he built his house in the late 1760s, he only lived there 8 or 9 years. And so when growing up in Marblehead, this is the Lee Mansion. And one of the ironies, I guess, is that one could write a more detailed monograph about the architectural features of one room in this house than about Jeremiah Lee's entire life. He is a man who did transform into a mansion. We know so little about him, and the house features so prominently in this town. It would be nice if we did know more about Jeremiah Lee, but we don't. And so this mausoleum that he built for himself, thinking that he was building a baronial hall for wonderful socializing for decades, was a place that he lived in for only a few years. But as it stands, it certainly is a very large expression of one man's ego and one man's success at a time that there was no United States of America, at a time that he was very successful in negotiating his way within somebody else's empire. Here we see the second floor, the grand and ornate interior of this structure, which really is no dwelling. These are original wallpapers. This is all the original carving at the second floor level of a grand staircase that takes up the entire middle section, central section of the first floor of the house. It is a public space for a public figure. It's not a cozy home, is it? We see so much in this interior that an architectural historian or a material culture expert could talk about, but of Lee's own interior, we know nothing whatsoever. No letter survives, no diary entry, not even an account book. The conditions under which Lee would die and the subsequent deterioration of Marblehead during the course of the war and after the war obviously led to the destruction of every single document that might have indicated Lee's activities as a rebel leader, or in fact Lee's own finances, which were extremely fraught by the time he died. So I think it's safe to say that his family covered everything up by destroying all that we might have known. So all of that vanished, and really so did he. He never made it to the United States of America and died here at a time that the war was just beginning towards that notion of an independent nation. He really remains a mystery. Marblehead, at the time Jeremiah Lee came here as a young man at the age of 22 in 1743, was a fishing town and had been for more than 100 years. It began as a fishing town in the 1630s. It was populated by people from a different part of England than the Puritans, and it remained a rather isolated peninsula with its own mores and its own rules of being, and most people left it alone. The Marbleheaders were considered a different race of people altogether. They did not fit into the rest of Massachusetts, and the place absolutely stank. It reeked of curing fish. There were tens of thousands of codfish curing along the waterfront of Marblehead at any given time. So no one wanted to visit, and the people who lived here, of course, had grown up and suffered nasal fatigue by the time they were out of their diapers, so it was okay with them. This fishing business was a great business in New England. It gave the merchants their stock in trade with regard to commerce in the West Indies, as well as commerce with the Iberian Peninsula, which is all they were allowed to do as colonials enmeshed in an empire. So the Marbleheaders, by the early 1700s, were sailing well offshore into the Gulf of Maine, onto the fishing banks off Nova Scotia, and then eventually out onto the Grand Bank of Newfoundland, 1,000 miles out to sea. There was nothing convenient about Marblehead in its access to the fisheries, but Marblehead had an infrastructure that was second to none in terms of the ability of the fishermen and of the shoremen, who were the men who actually owned the fishing vessels and cured the fish for the market when it came back. So this was not a seaport. Primarily it was a fishing port. It becomes a seaport starting in the 1730s, 1740s, just as the Lees show up. But it's worth taking a quick look at the economy of the town and what was really involved. Here we see men in a fish yard, and they have already landed the catch of cod that has come back from Newfoundland, and they've carted it out of the shallows where the salt was washed out, and they've laid it out in what was called fillets, split cod, on the fish flakes or fish fences, which were, as you can see, crude tables that could be turned towards the sun during the 2 or 3 weeks of the curing period. And it was quite an art form to take these codfish remains and turn them into a commodity that could be carried thousands of miles overseas and would not spoil. Marblehead was notable as the great codfish curing town. The merchantable cod, so-called, was rather valuable and too valuable to send down to the West Indies. It was sent over to Spain and Portugal and traded into the Catholic markets where everyone was eating fish, and made a lot of money for the merchants whose vessels carried the fish overseas, and they would trade it for salt and wine and fruit. Really, they were only supposed to trade it for salt under the British regulations, but Marblehead's economy was based on a very loose interpretation of the imperial law, and it was entirely responsible. That loose interpretation was entirely responsible for this very large urban place whose remains you see today. Had they obeyed the laws of the empire, they all would have been living in huts. So, for 2 or 3 months at a time, the fishermen would go off in schooners, small vessels, 50 tons burden, 5 or 6 men to a crew, and always a boy who was kicked around as an apprentice and was pretty much the cook on board, so everyone got a chance to complain to him every single night and toughen him up. And here's some arrows that are losing their way here. Roughly, one of those arrows is at Marblehead, and you can see by sailing east, well, you can see why going to Nova Scotia was always going down east. You can see that the trip was out to the Grand Bank, which is right out there, identified as the Great Bank of Newfoundland. It was about 1,000 miles out to sea, and it was just about due east from Marblehead. And once they got out there, the thing about the Grand Bank is it was essentially tableland. It was elevated quite close to the surface as opposed to the rest of the ocean out there, and was the breeding ground and feeding ground of the thing that used to be known as codfish before we came along in the 20th century and wiped it out. In those days it was inexhaustible, and the men would go out for 2 fairs in the spring, and it was called a fair, a fishing fair, and they would go out for at least 2 trips a year in the spring and the fall, out there for 3 months, sometimes longer, trying to catch these fish and fill up their vessels. They brought the salt with them to preserve the fish, and they would clean the fish every 24-hour sequence. So they'd be filling up their holds the whole time, and they would fish day and night. It was an extremely hazardous occupation. These are very small vessels out there. There's no radio communication, of course, and they're exposed to all kinds of horrific weather brewing up in the North Atlantic. And here they are out there on a good day on the Grand Bank. This is a good day for fishing, and you can imagine what kind of death rate was involved in the Marblehead fishery. When we talk about Jeremiah Lee and his friends, we're just talking about a tiny percentage of the people who lived in this town, most of whom, of course, never had their portrait painted, and who we don't think about, but who sired and mothered very large families and sent innumerable sons out to the Grand Bank, eventually around the world in merchant shipping. And my calculations are that there was a death rate of 10% per year amongst the fishermen, and 15% per year amongst the merchant sailors. So it was an incredibly dangerous business, and the loss of life was enormous. Here's a better look at what these guys are hauling in. It's a halibut. Those are the codfish and the halibut were the two real value fishes out there. And so these guys are happy. They're going to make some money off this night's work if they get back home after 3 months at sea. Well, most of them did get home. Here's a look at what's known as a pinky. That high stern tended to make the little schooner more seaworthy and keep more of the waves off the deck. As I say, the men were out there day and night fishing. They were pretty much snockered the entire time. They always left port with many barrels of rum. And rum was sort of the coffee, orange juice, and water of the time. So Marblehead had a drinking problem in those days, but thank God it doesn't now. So this pinky is coming into what was known in the early days as the Great Harbor. And you think of it as Marblehead Harbor, and you look across at those yacht clubs over all that expensive fiberglass, and it seems pretty tame. But to the early people here, that harbor was too big for the typical fisherman. It was too open. It was too exposed to the weather. There was too much wind. The waves would get in on easterlies and northeast storms. So the Great Harbor developed later, really in the very late 1600s and early into the 1700s, as commercial wharfage and moorings for visiting vessels. The heart of the town was back over at Little Harbor, which is where Marblehead began in the 1630s. And when the fishermen got home from the Grand Bank, this is where most of the fish was cured, along this kind of a shore. That's a little island to the right, and the rocky shores of sheltered coves were the preferred places. But really, everywhere from what is now Lighthouse Point all the way around to Fort Sewell along the waterfront of Marblehead was used in one way or another in connection with the curing of fish. The way the fish got overseas was the shoremen would sell. The shoremen were the men who owned the fishing vessels and cured up the fish, and they would sell it to the merchants at the merchant's price usually. And the merchants would pack it all up into barrels, stack it up with presses, and send it overseas in brigs and schooners. There really weren't any ships in these days before the Revolution. They were relatively small vessels, and some of the schooners that were used out at sea on the fishing grounds would double up as transportation to take the fish down to the West Indies and over to Europe as well. So from the West Indies, they are returning, they're exchanging their bad fish, what was called the refuse fish, the stuff that wasn't cured as well as it might have been. The refuse fish was traded to the sugar planters down on the islands in the Caribbean, and it was fed to the enslaved people that worked in the cane fields. And the return cargo would be invariably sugar and molasses. And this is what made the fortunes of people like the Lees and the Hoopers in Marblehead, in that they also had distilleries here in Marblehead and Salem, and that molasses was turned into New England rum. And as I say, New England rum was the popular beverage of the day all throughout the region. So they're turning their lowly codfish into high-end Mount Gay. And so that's what's going on with the West Indies. And as I say, over in Spain, they're returning largely with salt because they need immense quantities of salt to keep the fish preserved while they're out on the Grand Bank. And there's no salt here in British America, so it has to come from somewhere. So they made an exception for trade with the direct trade between the American merchants and the Iberians. Here's a look at a typical commercial operation. This happens to be Salem, but this could easily be one of the two commercial coves on the Great Harbor in Marblehead. A variety of different types of shipping. You see some short wharves and warehouses. Warehouses for stacking up the fish, storing the salt, and also warehouses for the wine and the rum that they are distilling. The two coves here on the Great Harbor were at the New Wharf, which is now the landing in Marblehead, and Neck's Cove, so-called, named after a family named Neck. Nothing to do with Marblehead Neck. Neck's Cove was where the Boston Yacht Club is today. It was all filled in to make for convenient parking a long time ago, even before I was born. It was always a busy harbor with various types of vessels coming and going. Some of these vessels were just coasting vessels that went up and down the coast to Maine to come back with firewood, or down to Baltimore to come back with flour. And for the men on board these ships, as I say, you could count on it as a short life, but a merry one. Here's a wonderful picture, the only one I know, of actual working class Marbleheaders. This is an engraving taken from a painting that was made of these two dudes in 1777. They were celebrating, I think, a successful privateering cruise early in the Revolutionary War. And on the left, you see Charles Halloran, aka the Earl of Kildare. And on the right, Ben Dennis, the Earl of Essex. There are a lot of Irishmen who washed up here in Marblehead and got along with the native population very well. So this wonderful picture is titled "A Friendly Bowl to a Generous Soul." It's my favorite picture of Marbleheaders. At any rate, these guys are past their expiration date. I'd say they both look at least 30 years old. This empire that Marblehead was a part of was headquartered in London, and it spread all over the world by the 18th century. As you can see, Marblehead is just a little blip in a little corner of this enormous commercial enterprise, ruled by a king. And Marblehead itself in the 1740s was ruled by a king. And here he is. Think of his wig as a crown. This man is Robert King Hooper, who was essentially the founder of Marblehead's commerce, overseas commerce. He was born in 1709 and had gone to work for a cousin of his named Joseph Swett, who was the first man in Marblehead to put together anything like an overseas trade. But Big Robert here knocked it out of the park. He married the boss's daughter, eldest daughter Ruth, which proved to be a very astute move on his part, because soon after the marriage, his patron died and he took over the Swett operation for himself. So Robert Hooper, in a period of about 20 years, became the richest man in Massachusetts, the ruler of the town of Marblehead, and the owner or mortgage holder of everything in sight. He was the first man to build a real mansion in this town. This is his 3-story house. Being a thrifty sort, what he did was to take down about a third of his father's house, which stood sideways to the street, and he built a 3-story facade onto the street as his monument to himself. in the late 1740s. So as he's building a very lucrative seaport here, Marblehead has morphed from being a fishing port to being a seaport as well. Other ambitious people start to show up. And one of them is Samuel Lee, who is a housewright from Manchester, Mass., meaning he builds things. But the things he was building were things like enormously long wharves in Boston. So he was maybe the most highly successful contractor in colonial Massachusetts, operating out of the little town, the very insignificant little town of Manchester, which I guess we have to call Manchester by the Sea. And he had the typical large family and a very large ambition to match it. And in 1743, when he's in his 50s, he moves to Marblehead to set up as a shipping merchant. And he brings his family with him, including his 22-year-old son, Jeremiah. I don't think the house looked this way. He bought a house in 1743 that was a nice house, and I don't think we actually know what he did with it. I think the house as it looks today has gone through a lot of changes. I'm not sure that it ever got to be 3 stories high. But anyway, he built up on the hill that overlooked the common of the town. So it was a prestige spot. And he quickly got himself appointed as a justice of the peace here in town and became a leading politician as well as a very successful shipping merchant. He brought along his rotund son, Jeremiah, into the business and set him up pretty much with a can't-fail operation, somewhat on the model of his new rival, Robert King Hooper. So as a young man, Daddy staked Jeremiah to this nice house where he moved in his 20s, and this overlooked the Lee wharves at Neck's Cove. And this would be the house that Jeremiah Lee lived in for most of his life. He lived here for 20 years as an adult, establishing his own business. The town got very big, relatively speaking. It eventually outgrew Salem as the second largest town in Massachusetts and was both larger in population and richer than Salem before the Revolution. There were public buildings. This is the earliest street watercolor of Marblehead. That building on the left still stands in the middle of the street. It's known as the townhouse. But the rest of the town was being built up in very solid houses by people who were doing very well in this very prosperous town that had been founded as a seaport and was still doing a lot of fishing. There were about 4,000 to 5,000 people living in Marblehead at that time. And when a couple of young men fell overboard and drowned, as happened every other week in the harbor because no one could swim, the whole town would turn out for a funeral, and that's what you're looking at here. Marblehead was building large new churches, was being visited by shipping from overseas. The British, of course, had the largest ships and often would come directly to Marblehead. It was a real bustling seaport, and Jeremiah Lee, as a young man, got his share of the golden crumbs here. In 1745, he marries Martha Swett. Martha Swett is a Patty. Patty Swett is a much younger sister of Ruth Swett, who married Robert King Hooper. So suddenly, young Jeremiah Lee is brothers-in-law with the guy who runs the town. And I wish we knew more about that relationship, but of course we don't. Both of them produced scads of children. Lee ended up producing 9 children with Patty, and Hooper ended up with 3 wives, 5 wives, how many? 4 wives. And I think he had children with 3 out of 4. So just one had 16 children. His eldest, he was the son of a soap maker named a tallow chandler named Greenfield Hooper. And Robert and Ruth's first child was a boy, and they named him Greenfield. And when he died at the age of 23, Ruth had their last child, a son, whom they named Greenfield. So these are prolific people here in Marblehead, and both Jeremiah Lee and Robert Hooper have founded very large families. These are very ambitious men, and they're looking down the road at dynasties, aren't they? In 1753, old Judge Samuel Lee dies, and Jeremiah goes into business for himself. In 1756, he grabbed a rather unobtrusive spot along the waterfront, and he made it the most important place in Marblehead. He built an enormous warehouse and a wharf. And incredibly, his warehouse, built in 1756, still stands as a frame inside some very high-end condos, of course, here on the waterfront in Marblehead. So for those of you who are going on to the Boston Yacht Club, the site of the Boston Yacht Club is to the right, that low building, which was actually sort of a coal pit. And the building to the left, or left center, the one with the almost flat roof, that was Lee's warehouse. It would have had a pitch roof back in the old days, but by the time this photograph was taken, the roof had been changed. It was the biggest warehouse building in Marblehead. Here's a closer look at it. And what might actually be sort of the original or certainly late replacement pilings of Lee's Wharf. There would have been floats extending down from it, but you can see there's a stairway back from the stonework. And this was, in its day, in the 1750s, this was the biggest storage facility and trading wharf in the town. So if you can keep that picture in your mind, I'm going to flip us over to today. That's essentially the same view, and if you take away the porches and the awnings and this and that, that building is Jeremiah Lee's own warehouse, 10 years older than the house itself. It was a discovery I made 3 years ago when the condo owners asked me to come down and take a look at what they had. So it was pretty wonderful to walk into that building and see these enormous wooden beams that had been used for all of the fish and rum and salt that Jeremiah Lee had been bringing in and out of this town.
I hate to ask, but you tell me which one is the building, because I'm a little confused.
Well, let's go back to this picture and see if I can confuse you more.
Okay. This is a pointer. Is it the one with the awnings?
Yes. Yep. Lee had a fleet of ships. He had about 20 trading vessels going out, and he was also part owner of many of the fishing vessels. This wonderful watercolor, which was not done en grise, but is just a black and white version of the watercolor, was done by a humble ship-rigger in Marblehead named Ashley Bowen, who got most of his work from Jeremiah Lee, and who wasn't always employed, so he spent a lot of his time making pictures of things that he saw or vessels that he'd sailed on as a young man. And this is it's the only view we have of an actual Jeremiah Lee-owned vessel. And there is the incredible blank white house flag of Jeremiah Lee, which I have always thought was some kind of very ominous harbinger of what was going to happen to this man who left no trace of himself behind. I cannot pronounce the name of that vessel. I defy anyone to do it. But it was, the commander was a man named Peter Green from Marblehead. And wonderfully enough, Ashley Bowen also kept a diary, and his diary has been published. So you can kind of follow him on his early travels, including on this vessel. Jeremiah Lee had lots of rivals and business associates in Marblehead. There were about 15 to 20 merchants who were also involved in making very large fortunes within the British Empire. This guy was Jacob Fowle. Again, he, like Lee's own father, began as a contractor and did extremely well for himself and became the colonel of the militia regiment, thus his gun and sash. He was on the older side at the time that Lee was coming up, but there was a group of much younger Marbleheaders who didn't have silver spoons, but who were very aggressive and elbowed their way into the merchant class, most notably the four Glover brothers. This is the leader of the pack, Jonathan Glover. He was a kid who came from Salem with his three little brothers after their father had died. Their father was a rather humble shipwright in Salem. Their mom married a prosperous Marbleheader named Benjamin Stacy, who had begun as a hat maker. Sounds like a modest kind of occupation, but I think he was sort of the Brooks Brothers of Marblehead. He was able to acquire taverns and to engage in merchant shipping, and he had no children of his own. So all that he knew and all that he had amassed, he turned over to his four little stepsons. And he brought this fella, Jonathan Glover, into partnership with him when Benjamin Stacy was still in his prime. Jonathan Glover was by far the leader of this tribe of upstart Glovers. They were fairly ambitious, arrogant types. And Jonathan Glover was the first person in Marblehead to build a recognizable freestanding three-story mansion in 1760. It was quite the bow shot in establishing his own credibility as a leader of the town. And this beautiful house stands back from Front Street today, and when built, it had a lawn that rolled forward for about 150 feet right down to the street. Today, it's most of that lawn has been taken up by later construction, but that is the wonderful Jonathan Glover house that he built for himself when he was still in his 30s. He had a couple of younger brothers. One of them was this guy, John Glover, who was of this same tribe of very ambitious people, but without a real stake, the way Jeremiah Lee had a stake or Jacob Fowle had a stake. And in fact, Jonathan Glover began as a hat maker, and John Glover began as a shoemaker. And these guys worked their way up together, pooling their resources and getting involved in overseas trade. So again, as a young man, John Glover is building a much more modest, typical Marblehead house with the gambrel roof, while his brother is showing off nearby. Some of the other rivals that Jeremiah Lee knew were this is a later picture, but not too much later. This is Elbridge Gerry, who was the heir of the very wealthy Elbridge and Russell families. One of them came from Bristol, England, and one of them, the Russell family, was one generation removed from Bristol here in Marblehead. They had a ton of money. Their father was an English sea captain who saw a good opportunity in marrying Miss Russell and produced a bunch of extremely able young men, Elbridge being the most able, and as many of you know, he will go on to be vice president of a thing that doesn't exist in my talk. Another one of the rivals and associates was Azer Orn, who was the baron of the lower end of Marblehead, the old fishing part of Marblehead. The Ornes were a very old family, both in Marblehead and Salem. And Azer Orne was the man who made the big fortune from the downtown. Of course, Salem was also involved in the same thing as Marblehead was. One of Lee's rivals was a much younger man, sort of bore the same relationship in age to Lee that he did to Robert Hooper, and this is Elias Haskett Derby, a man with two different colored eyes, but who was always looking for the main chance. And after the Revolution, he would find it and start building houses like this for himself over in Salem. But I get ahead of myself. Let's go back to good old King Hooper. This is 1750s and 60s. Things are changing here in North America. The big deal is that the British, after many misadventures, have finally taken Canada from the French. And it took about 5 years and several armies being ground up, unable to defeat Montcalm. And then finally in 1759 and 1760 at Montreal and Quebec, the British prevailed. But they nearly bankrupted themselves fighting this war that the people in New England had not asked for. It was part of the overall policy of imperial conquest. But the people in New England got saddled with all the tax burden that the British Empire decided to try and impose on its holdings. And the richest people were the ones who were subject to losing the most money. Robert Hooper decided that he would get cozy with the British authorities as a strategy for maintaining his business. He was concerned about not just his own future, but he was getting older and he had several sons. Here's Joseph Hooper, a graduate of Harvard, a pretty obnoxious loyalist when the time came, as you might imagine from that mug, and staked to a rope walk here by his father in Marblehead. He was not really engaged so much in commerce as in the manufacture of cordage. So this is what the world is like when Jeremiah Lee decides to upgrade. Maybe it was Patty that decided to upgrade. But anyway, they've been living in that nice little house down there near the cove. And the British were cracking down on the trade that Lee was involved in, but he was still fabulously wealthy. And so by October of 1766, we see that he has this new house, which I hope most of you had a chance to go through it. In October of 1766, the man who I've mentioned, Ashley Bowen, who is the watercolorist and rigger, gets work from Colonel Lee, and his entry there is October 4th. I love the one on October 2nd. He's got nothing to do for the second straight day, and he says, walking to and fro, pilgrim-like. So on the 4th here, at work for Colonel Lee, tarring parceling for the top of his new house a day. And then he's at work in fitting parceling for Colonel Lee. At work on Colonel Lee's house for after breakfast till 6 o'clock. At work on Colonel Lee's house from after breakfast, finished covering Colonel Lee's house with parceling, and then a ship is burnt. What's he doing? This is tar paper. He is tarring up a bunch of cloth to put it on the roof of this new house. So here's the man. The only diarist in Marblehead happens to be the man who is actually telling us that Jeremiah Lee's house is now under roof, which is a pretty wonderful thing. It was a big roof, and Ashley was up there laying down the original tar paper. So, great spot, isn't it? It was at the foot of the training field hill. And one of the reasons why Lee assembled the parcel down there is not only as a good site for his big house, but also very beautiful grounds. And he tore down about 4 houses to make the space for this new place. I'm sure he had a major hand in the design of the thing. At any rate, once he built it, and I'm going to say it was pretty much finished in 1766, his rivals took note, and Robert King Hooper immediately built this house on the left with the cupola on top of the hill overlooking Jeremiah Lee's house, and never lived in the place. He built it as a take that, Jeremiah sort of gesture, and he rented it out to visiting high rollers. And on the other side of the old Samuel Lee house, another Robert Hooper, almost no relation to Robert King Hooper, built this place in 1769. So Lee's challenge to his business associates was met with a spate of building around town by these wealthy business rivals and friends. The politics in the town was growing fierce. The lines were starting to form between those who were hewing to the British line and those who realized that if things kept on the way they were going, they would all go bankrupt. We know this not so much from anything written in Marblehead as from what was going on in Boston. And as you will recall, by 1768, Boston was so opposed to all of the British policies, including the Navigation Acts, that the English actually sent over an army of occupation. That's just down the road, and it was a big deal, and it was kind of the end of any hope that there might be a peaceful resolution of the growing problems between Americans and the British. And let me say that this was not really a from-the-street kind of revolutionary spirit. It was the British threat to the existing trade of the wealthiest of the Americans that really made the revolution happen, and that mobilized the money that brought in the powder and the shot, and that connected all the educated people in New England and eventually down to the Tidewater with each other. Their businesses were threatened, and their livelihoods were going to be lost. And for someone like Jeremiah Lee, he had to make a decision about this enormous house, which had 5 slaves in it, and a bunch of kids, and his future. And what I see happening is almost from the day he built this house, he began to hemorrhage money. By 1774, he was down 650% of where he had been. And so he really had no choice. If he were to continue as a friend of the British, he would have lost everything. And so he throws in with the Sons of Liberty, probably in a very overt way by 1770. He is, by 1751, the colonel of the local regiment. And that regiment is made up of fishermen who have no love for the British and who are way ahead of most other regiments locally in terms of their determination to engage in a war. There must have been many deep, long conversations here in Lee's house with his friends as to what the future might bring. But what it did bring to Marblehead in 1773 was a horrible epidemic of smallpox, and wiped out hundreds of people. The wealthier people were able to get inoculated, and the poor people weren't. And Lee invested in building a hospital out on a local island with the Glover brothers and Asa Orne and Gary. And then he realized that this maybe wasn't such a great idea in terms of his political popularity, in that there were an immense number of poor families in this town who deeply resented the building of this for-profit hospital. I think it was called Partners, but I may be wrong. I may be wrong. At any rate, Lee backed out. Lee backed out, and so did Orne, and so did Gary, and they sold out their interest to Jonathan Glover. And Jonathan Glover brings his brothers and a couple of the other young Turks into this deal. They're looking for big money. Lee already has it. Hooper has it. These guys are willing to take risks that other people don't. It was a disaster for them. Elbridge Gerry, who ends up being one of the revolutionary leaders, is a man who had to take a one-year time out when the fishermen of Marblehead rose up against him and the Glovers and burned down their hospital. And the volatility of the mobility in the street was something that really shocked the Glovers and really shocked Orne and Gerry. And I think Lee and Hooper anticipated it. So the whole revolutionary movement in Marblehead was derailed except for Jeremiah Lee. He was the only credible rebel leader standing who hadn't been involved in this disaster. So we see him as by this time, by 1774, as a pure rebel leader. He's deeply involved not only in Massachusetts politics. He was the chairman of the Essex Rebel Congress, which issued the Essex Resolves based on the model of the Suffolk Resolves, sent down to the Continental Congress. He was elected by Marblehead to attend the Continental Congress, but he deferred to Elbridge Gerry. He also was the chairman of two of the committees of the rebel legislature, because by October of 1774, the Massachusetts legislature, which was now under a military rule by a military governor named Thomas Gage, had decided to hold its own proceedings as an independent body. And Lee was one of the leaders of that rebel Congress. He was on the committee that was in charge of procuring munitions, and he himself, with his contacts in Spain, directly imported perhaps as much as hundreds of tons of cannon and powder and shot. And he was also on the committee that opened relations with other rebels down south. And we find him disappearing a lot from Marblehead, in and out this door a lot, to go arrange for supplies to come up from the Chesapeake in case of a war. People had to be fed. And also to create goodwill with the places like Virginia and Maryland that weren't so advanced in their rebel sentiment. So he was a really profoundly important person at this time, this man as big as a house. And it's also the moment at which Boston is shut down. The Tea Party had brought on the arrival of British armies and Thomas Gage, and you may recall from your history that the port of Boston was completely shut down. There was no shipping anymore. The new capital of Massachusetts was Salem, and the new capital of the British customs was Marblehead. So Boston people literally could not get access to food shipped in, and the Marbleheaders would in a very, very generous way, would take large quantities of their fish and bring it into Boston to feed the people of Boston. And this is where Lee began to mobilize his friends down in Baltimore and Richmond to start providing lots of flour and the other rudiments of trying to survive from day to day. And here's a political cartoon showing some Marbleheaders feeding the captive Bostonians. I love that. It's one of the very few images that actually shows sailors in their working class garb. There they are. We're almost done, folks. So here's Robert Hooper. He's on the wrong side of this very powerful movement inside the town. After the debacle over the burning of the hospital, he had done a very naked power play in the politics of the town to try and turn the working class folks against the men who had been their rebel leaders, but he was really up against Jeremiah Lee, his brother-in-law, and Lee had very powerful connections to most of the important rebel people in town, and he employed hundreds of the sailors and the fishermen, and they had great loyalty to him and a lot of belief that he was on the right side of this coming conflict. So these are last days. Here we are looking down from the house where Jeremiah Lee was a young man when he first came to Marblehead, the Yellow House, down at the little teeny tiny house he built for himself. Down the row of Lees and Hoopers. And as Jeremiah Lee went off with his friends Azer Orn and Elbridge Gerry to one of the rebel congresses that was being held actually in Watertown in those days, but it ended up in Concord. He was there to represent Marblehead, but also to do his committee work in trying to put together all the logistics for what was obviously a coming war. And sadly for him, on the night of April 18th, he was in a tavern with his two Marblehead friends, and they were alarmed in the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the night, by the cry of Revere or Dawes that the regulars were out. And these three guys thought, of course, that the British must be coming for them. And so they, without even stopping to get dressed, they ran out in their night clothes as fast as they could. And I hate to think of how slow Jeremiah Lee was at 420 pounds or whatever he weighed, but since Gary probably never weighed more than 160, I figured they were following Gary, and they were running through the stubble of a cornfield out back of this tavern, and really running for their lives, and running in terror in the middle of an April night, a cold April night. And these guys had been on the road for a while, attending the Congress, and who knows who had the sniffles. We don't know, really, but it was a traumatic event. It was certainly a traumatic event for Jeremiah Lee. I think he was absolutely terrified by what had happened. He was not physically a man who was in any condition to be running across a field, and they spent most of the night hiding out. And what happened to Jeremiah Lee, the colonel of the rebel regiment of Marblehead, and the man who was most in charge of bringing in the munitions for this war that was about to happen, and the man largely in charge of making the alliances with the other nabobs of the Chesapeake. This event takes place on the night of April 18th, and by May 10th he was dead. He had probably been gobbled up by pneumonia, but I think it was coupled with true terrorized trauma of that night. And that was not just the end of the senior leader of the rebel movement here in Marblehead, but it was a very clear-cut demarcation line between this town's great prosperity and generations of disastrous poverty. Without going into it in any detail, the United States, the 8 years of war for Marblehead ended up killing about 500 men, leaving literally thousands of children as orphans or fatherless, and widows without any hope of ever remarrying. The town was busted flat, 8 years of no fishing and no trade. And when the war ended and there was the United States of America, it was the beginning of many decades of grinding hardship for the people of Marblehead. There were no Lees left. The family was ruined. When all was said and done, Jeremiah Lee's estate was pretty much balanced out. He left more than 28,000 pounds in debt to British creditors. But at least they were able to pay off the debts. Robert King Hooper lives to be a very old man and dies in 1790, and his estate was worth a dime on the dollar. He had gone completely bankrupt. All of these great Marblehead trading families from before the war had been destroyed, and their descendants didn't even stay here. So that's a story of a rise and a fall. Marblehead became a fishing town again. Here's a family on a typical bluff waving goodbye to the fleet as they leave, knowing that 3 or 4 of those schooners aren't coming back. And that's the way it goes right into the 1840s. And I will leave you of this view from Fort Sewell, one that no doubt Jeremiah Lee himself had on many occasions. Looking out to sea here with the thought of a family that had been ruined, and no hope ever again of seeing that vessel returning with the mysterious and provocative blank white flag of Colonel Jeremiah Lee. Thank you very much.